I suppose the first thing to say about Aristotle is that he's one of the great foundational thinkers of what's come to be called the Western tradition. And he was the student for a long time of Plato, a philosopher in his own right in Athens, who in his turn was the student of Socrates. And so we have a very interesting lineage from Socrates of Athens to Plato to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle was born in the northern city of Stagira, and at about 17 or 18, when he was a teenager, he went off to college, or the equivalent of college, and that is he went to Athens, and there, as I say, met Plato, and studied with Plato for something like 20 years until Plato's death. He left Athens for a time, perhaps for political reasons, but then returned and founded his own school at the Lyceum. His students were known as the Peripatetics, perhaps because they had the habit of, allegedly, of walking and talking, and that's related to the verb to walk or to stroll. And he taught there for about a dozen years or so, and in that time, of course, had a number of students in his school and wrote many of the works that have come down to us. Now, he was a very prolific author, Aristotle was, but estimates are that we only have about a third of his writings, unfortunately. For example, he, like his teacher Plato, wrote dialogues, and unfortunately, we don't have any of Aristotle's dialogues. What survives are his treatises, and the range of works that Aristotle wrote is just astonishing, from logic to natural science, biology. He wrote several books about animals, the motions of animals, and so on. He wrote about, on the heaven, metaphysics, which is the study of being as being, very difficult and challenging works, profoundly influential works. But the book that I have translated, together with Susan Collins of the University of Houston, is the Nicomachean Ethics. And that, he says, is part one of his two-part treatment of what he calls philosophy of human affairs, the human things, not the subhuman, the animals and so on, and not the suprahuman, the heavens and so on, but the middle range of things, that is to say, the human beings. Now, the title Nicomachean Ethics is striking. He refers to the book only as the Ethics, and Nicomachean was added later. It was the name of both his son and his father, Nicomachus. And so speculation is that perhaps it was dedicated to his father at some point, or perhaps more likely that his son served as the editor of the text, and so it became known as the Nicomachean Ethics. Now, the word ethics has a slightly different, or at least maybe more precise meaning to Aristotle than it does in ordinary speech today. What it means for Aristotle is literally things pertaining to one's character. And so much of the book is devoted to a study of how it is that we develop our characters. And he stresses, among other things, one's nature, of course. One has certain strengths and weaknesses, but also habit or habituation. And so he stresses very much the importance of learning the right habits from a very early age on. And our character is tested or comes to sight not so much by what we think about or rationalize about, but how it is that we act, as it were, without thinking about it. I mean, I could give this example, that if you find a wallet on the street and you have to think for half an hour about whether or not you'll return it to the owner, that's a bad sign, that in a way one should be habituated to do the right thing, or as Aristotle would put it, to act for the sake of what is noble, and that's a sign of one's character. Now, the key concept in his analysis of our character, that is partly at least through the product of habituation, is the word arete, the Greek word arete. And that can be translated in various ways, either as excellence or, as we translate it, virtue. And so Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics is the source, really, of what has come to be called virtue ethics. And according to Aristotle, there are two kinds of virtue, moral virtue and intellectual or contemplative virtue. And he traces that back to human nature, ultimately, but to the work or the activity characteristic of human beings, which he says are of two kinds. Human beings have the capacity to act, to make, to do, produce, and to think. And therefore we have two, unlike animals, say, which don't think in the sense that we can. They don't have reason in the way that we do. There are two excellences or virtues characteristic of human beings. Excellence in action, stemming from our characters or moral virtue, and excellence in thinking, understanding the world correctly as it is, including ourselves. And so the Nicomachean Ethics as a whole is an extended inquiry into this idea of excellence or virtue. Most of it devoted to moral virtue, but the book ends and in a way culminates in his treatment of theoretical or contemplative virtue, the correct understanding of things. And I suppose one of the most striking things about his treatment of virtue is that he says there are 11 moral virtues. Not 10, not 12, 11. And he identifies them. And one of the interesting and in a way fun things to do with students before I begin to teach the book is to ask them what qualities they admire. You don't have to use the word virtue if that sounds too old-fashioned. And they will, can easily come up with a long list: honesty, integrity, tolerance, and so on. And then you can compare that list with Aristotle's. And of course, there are some overlaps. Courage, for example, is the first moral virtue that he takes up, and students almost always mention courage as a virtue they admire. But there are some things that are very strange. Liberality, as he calls it, or a kind of generosity. Generosity on a great scale as well. One of the strangest moral virtues he takes up is what he calls magnanimity or greatness of soul, as we translate it literally in the book. And that is the proper attitude toward honor, he says. And the magnanimous or great-souled human being knows that he or she deserves great honor and claims that honor for himself. And students sometimes are very troubled or put off by such a virtue because it's, in a way, the opposite of humility, which one often associates with as a Christian virtue, for example. And this is very different from what Aristotle presents. So he gives a kind of taxonomy of excellence in action, moral virtue, some of them very familiar to us: courage, justice, some quite strange. And as I say, the other kind of virtue in which the book culminates is theoretical or contemplative virtue. And it's important to see, I think, that for Aristotle, as great and as admirable as the moral virtues are, the higher kind of virtue is contemplative virtue or theoretical virtue. So that the highest activity of a human being is correct understanding, or wisdom, as he calls it. Now, you can't have wisdom without the moral virtues. And so the human package, so to speak, that would be complete would have to combine both. And students are often very moved by his portrait of the human being who possesses all of the virtues combined. And I suppose the peak case for Aristotle would be, of course, the philosopher. So Aristotle himself is one of the great philosophic thinkers, the foundational thinkers of the West. And his Nicomachean Ethics is, as I say, part one of his two-part treatment of what he calls the philosophy of human affairs. Aristotle is, as I say, one of the great foundational thinkers in what has come to be called the Western tradition. He was the intellectual son, so to speak, of Plato, and the intellectual grandson of Socrates. But unlike Socrates, he wrote quite a lot. Socrates never wrote anything. And for our knowledge of Socrates, we rely on Plato and also Xenophon, another student of Socrates. Aristotle, on the other hand, was willing to write, and did write, a very great deal on a wide range of subjects. And those writings, though many of them have been lost, a good number of them do survive on a very wide range of topics. And his influence, I think, is best seen probably in the tradition that arose of commentaries. Many commentaries have been written on Aristotle's works. Aristotle's prose tends to be quite difficult and quite condensed, and so it naturally lends itself to commentary. And here I have in mind the absorption of Aristotle's thought in the three great religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and of course Islam. In the Christian tradition, perhaps the greatest commentator is St. Thomas Aquinas. And he wrote very lengthy commentaries on almost all the works of Aristotle. And they're extraordinarily helpful and learned and thoughtful. And they literally take Aristotle line by line. And St. Thomas will spell out what he thinks Aristotle is saying, gives examples to flesh out Aristotle's arguments, and will also show the ways in which Aristotle's thought is and is not compatible with Christian doctrine. And the interface between if I can call it pagan philosophy and the advent of Christianity in especially Thomas Aquinas is fascinating. But also I think it's important to mention the rich tradition of commentary in the Islamic tradition as well. Averroes perhaps is the best known. He became known as the commentator on the philosopher. And he would simply refer to Aristotle as the philosopher says and proceed. And in these ways, both Thomas Aquinas, among other Christians, Averroes and other Islamic thinkers attempted to bring philosophy into a religious tradition which otherwise didn't have it or had different philosophic traditions. I might mention in this context also Moses Maimonides, one of the great Jewish thinkers of the Middle Ages, who in his book called The Guide for the Perplexed spoke at length about Aristotle. Now, he didn't write a commentary in the same sense as the other thinkers did, but the influence, the explicit influence of Aristotle is very great also on Maimonides. In fact, Maimonides paid Aristotle a very great compliment. He said that everything Aristotle said about what he called the sublunary world, that is this world, as opposed to the heavens, was correct. That everything else, so the ethics, the politics, that's right, according to Maimonides. A very great compliment from a high observer. So in these ways, Aristotle was brought up into the medieval tradition, and really his influence in the West certainly lasted up until arguably the 16th and even the 17th century. One of the great architects of the modern understanding of things, Thomas Hobbes, complained in his book, The Leviathan, about the influence of Aristotle still in the universities, and that this was all wrong and had to be undone. But this is relatively late already. And Hobbes still felt that Aristotle's hand was in everything and that this had to be, in important respects, undone. I would say that in the late 19th and early 20th century, there's been a revival of interest, serious interest in Aristotle again. Now that's for complicated reasons, partly a sense that there may be something missing from the modern project, as it's been called. Modern political philosophy perhaps needs a guidance lacking in Hobbes and John Locke and others. There's been a return to what I called virtue ethics as a way to try to take our bearings and think more seriously in a richer way about correct action in the world and moral responsibility and so on. And in that movement, Aristotle has played a very important role. So certainly his influence has waxed and waned over the centuries. But it's remarkable the extent to which his writings, his thought, have survived and are still looked to for serious guidance. You could say that there's two reasons really to read Aristotle today. One is historical. It's a fact that Aristotle's thought has been very influential over a long period of time. You couldn't understand Aquinas, I think, without having some background in Aristotle, for example. But that's an historical reason, and serious though it is, I think the other, in a way more serious reason to study Aristotle is that what he says might be true. And that that has become a possibility again with the uncertainties plaguing modern and even postmodern life. That there are a growing number of scholars, I think, for whom Aristotle is or deserves to be at the table as a live interlocutor. And so our translation of the Ethics, we hope, will in some way contribute to that ongoing conversation with Aristotle. There are several translations in English of the Nicomachean Ethics available. and at the risk of hurting sales, I might even say some good ones. Why then did I and my collaborator, Susan Collins, decide to try our hand at another one? Several reasons, really. One, I'll admit, is perfectly selfish. I wanted to go through the text in a way with a kind of care and attention to detail, I hope, that translation forces upon you. So it was partly my wish to grapple with the text directly that led me to try to do a translation. The other reason I would say is that there's been a kind of fashion or trend in translations. In the 19th century, you found very beautiful, polished English translations of Greek texts, which were not particularly accurate. And they were aimed, I assume, at a general reading audience who wanted to get a kind of sense of what Aristotle was about, without studying it line by line the way the great commentators had. And in the 19th century, you could have assumed a knowledge of a reading knowledge of ancient Greek on the part of an educated audience. And so for those people, they could read it directly in Greek. And for a more general audience, these sort of polished, almost paraphrases in some cases, would suffice. In the 20th century, and I would say especially in the latter half of the 20th century, one can, of course, no longer assume on the part of an educated audience an ability to read Greek. And so it was gradually felt that translations had to become more accurate, even more literal than they had been in the prior century, because so few people could read Greek anymore. And our translation takes its place in that kind of trend toward a more literal, we hope more exact, rendering of the Greek text. So, for example, if the word nature appears in the text, we always render it, the Greek word phusis, or the related verb, we always render it with some word related to nature, so that a reader can track the use and non-use of, for example, nature. That's just a very simple example. So there's been a kind of return to more literal translations to meet the need of an educated audience. We hope that ours is the most literal while also at the same time being readable. This, of course, is the great balance. Some of the translations of the 19th century that I mentioned are beautiful. They're not very reliable, but they're beautiful English. We hope, at least, to have hit the balance between exactness and literalness and a kind of contemporary readability. That, at least, was our goal. The other thing we thought were missing from the available translations are some apparatus that will help a student, especially, approach the text for the first time. So, for example, we have a very lengthy index, a subject index with proper names. We have an outline of the argument. We have an outline of the 11 moral virtues with their corresponding vices. Aristotle, as you know, has this rather neat schema that a virtue is a kind of golden mean between two extremes, the vices. So, for example, courage is the moral virtue, but there's a defect of cowardice, but also a corresponding excess of recklessness or boldness. You can be too excessively courageous, take unnecessary or foolish risks. And so we tried to lay that out in a chart for a student. And we hope that that will be helpful for students in the classroom. We always had our students in mind, really, ultimately, of what we think would be helpful for them in approaching this book, which, it has to be said, is difficult. Aristotle's prose is challenging. It's notoriously compressed, hence the need for commentaries. And so we tried to give some helps to students along the way in our volume. The target audience of the Nicomachean Ethics is a little difficult for me to say. As I mentioned, the prose is difficult. It's a challenging book. There's no question about that. And it requires careful study, and I think it certainly benefits from having a teacher who's waded through it before. The first audience surely would be college students, and we suspect that will be the principal audience for our book, are students studying philosophy, theology, humanistic studies of one sort or another, Western Civ programs, for example. And so we hope that in that setting the book will be very useful to students. The difficulty notwithstanding of the book, I do think there is a case to be made for the book appealing to a more general audience. And I would say this, that in the United States and in Western liberal democracies generally, the great source of pride is that we live in free countries. We're free to pursue happiness as we think best, with a minimum of intervention at least. Not none, but a minimum. But this imposes on us as free individuals living in a free country, in a way, a great challenge and even a burden, because we have to answer more or less on our own the question of how to be free, or what to do with that freedom. In other words, what's the content of a good or worthwhile life? And it seems to me that Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is devoted to answering nothing other than that question. And so, though it's a very old book, millennia old, the political circumstances in which he lived were very different from our own. I think he would have been admiring of the United States in many ways, astonished at its size and power in the world and its prosperity. Still, I think he would have thought it was a very strange place in many ways. But the most important connection, I think, between the Nicomachean Ethics and us is this concern, a shared concern, for the good life for a human being. That question still is an intelligible one to us. And in a way, precisely because we live in a free country, it's a more urgent question for us as individuals. What ought I to do with this great freedom? And I do think the Nicomachean Ethics is a very powerful inquiry into that very question. And again, to go back to students, I think if you present this rather austere book in that light, or with a view to that question, it comes alive and it opens up in a way that it otherwise might not. What are the qualities, the moral virtues that I really admire? How does my list compare with Aristotle's? Why does he stress so much one virtue while not even mentioning another that we take most seriously, perhaps? Who's right? And once you engage Aristotle directly in that kind of a conversation, I do think it, as I say, brings the book alive and opens it up to a broader audience. Yesterday I received a request from a prisoner in a maximum security facility for a copy of the Nicomachean Ethics, because he'd been reading philosophy for many years and decided that because he'd read about our book, that he thought that he should take a look into Aristotle. So there's a broad audience for you.